Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from July 23rd, 2017. We begin our study in the book of Proverbs with Pastor Dax.
So we're taking a break here from John's Gospel, and for the rest of the summer, 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to be in Proverbs. Kind of a challenging book to preach from if you've read Proverbs, because you get a lot of little two-line statements and that's it. So we're going to trace some of the themes, some of the big themes through Proverbs. But today I just want to introduce you to the book and kind of set the stage for the next several weeks. Have you ever thought about the question I asked the kids, what would you wish for if you had Aladdin's magic lantern? Riches? Power? Revenge? That special someone? If God gave you a blank check, how would you fill in the blank? That's exactly the situation that King Solomon found himself in that one night when God appeared to him in a dream and he said, "Ask what I shall give to you." It's not quite "your wish is my command," but it's pretty close. Ask, what shall I give to you? And what does Solomon request? His words, "Give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil." He could have asked for anything at all. And Solomon asks for wisdom, which in itself shows some wisdom already, huh? God's response is in 1 Kings 3. God's response, he's so pleased with Solomon's request for wisdom. Listen to what he says. "Because you have asked this, wisdom, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days." He's so pleased at Solomon's request for wisdom, he throws in riches and honor to boot. And early on there in 1 Kings, we see one amazing expression after another of Solomon's wisdom on display. Word of his great wisdom spread near and far, even reaching the court of the Queen of Sheba. Listen to her impression when she met him. She says, "The report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report that I heard. Happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom." Wisdom. Is it something that you desire? I mean, of course, you probably want a little wisdom for the really important decisions in life, right? Like what career path to choose, whether or not to get married, and if so, to whom, where to live, those kinds of things. Everybody's ready to give the lantern a little rub for that kind of stuff, right? Hoping that God will prove to be a faithful genie. But is that how God wants us to live? Is that how God wants us to relate to him? What is wisdom, anyway? And how do we get it? It's not information. Okay, we have access to more data than every other previous generation combined, but still lack wisdom. It's not about intellect. You could memorize the entire Bible by heart and still not have wisdom. It's not about morals. You could live perfectly by all of God's rules and yet be so ugly about it that nobody wants anything to do with you. Take Proverbs 27:14, for example. And we're going to jump around here. "Whoever blesses his neighbor with a loud voice rising early in the morning will be counted as cursing." Some of you live with people like this, right? Don't talk to me after my second cup of coffee, right? It's good to know that a well-intentioned but poorly timed greeting can backfire. But you're not going to find that in the Ten Commandments. How about this one? It is better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. Amen. Now, I'm not thinking of any wife in particular, right? But this is helpful information to have, right? But again, you're not going to find that kind of thing in the great prophetic passages of Isaiah or Ezekiel. You see, we live in a world where sometimes the details are small enough that they escape the big, broad strokes of the law and the prophets. Even as a believer, if you seek the holiness of the law and if you're inspired by the visions of the prophets, you can still make a mess of your life and your family and your workplace and your church. You need more than rules. You need wisdom for daily life. But what is wisdom? Well, interestingly, the same word translated wisdom here in Proverbs 1 is also used in Exodus 34 to describe the skill of an artist adorning the tabernacle. It's the same word again used in Jeremiah 10 to speak of the expertise of goldsmiths. The same word is found once again in Psalm 107, where it's used to speak of the know-how of sailors at sea. So do you hear the shared idea there? Do you get the sense of this? What is this telling us? It's telling us, in essence, that wisdom is a skill. It's the ability and the competency to do a job. And God gives us the book of Proverbs to impart this wisdom to us, to coach us in the skills that we need to navigate the complexities of life. Wisdom for a Christian displays itself in the moment-by-moment choices you make that reflect the gospel. Choices that, quite frankly, are not always addressed in the rules. So in light of all of this, my agenda is very simple this morning. I first want to briefly introduce you to the book of Proverbs and its unique style. And then secondly, and much more importantly, I want to draw your attention to the necessary prerequisite of reading Proverbs, without which nothing else I say will make any difference to you at all. Okay, so let's begin by thinking about the unique literary style of this book. Notice verse 1 there in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. The Proverbs of Solomon. So this isn't a song like the Song of Solomon. It's not history like we read about in 1 Kings. It's not apocalyptic like the book of Revelation. And it's not a gospel like we've been studying in the book of John. Each of those God-inspired writings has a unique literary style that requires us to read it on its own terms. So don't be intimidated by that. Okay, if you don't have an English degree, you already do this all the time. So if you open up an envelope and take out a piece of paper that begins, Dear Jim, and is signed at the bottom, Love Mary, you know what that is. You don't read that like a science fiction novel because you understand it's a letter. And so you read it according to the genre of a letter. If you pull a book off a shelf, even if it's missing its cover, and the first words are, Once Upon a Time, nobody has to tell you that that's a fairy tale, right? You've learned that. You read a recipe differently than you read a birthday card or song lyrics or a newspaper article. What we have here are Proverbs. For the most part, 2 short lines of poetry expressing one general truth of wisdom. And that's what you find predominantly in chapters 10 through 29 of this book. And in the final section of this book, chapters 30 and 31, you find longer poetic units, which is also the case with the opening section of this book, chapters 1 through 9. But in these opening chapters, you'll quickly discover an element that might surprise you. 2 alluring women, each appealing for your ultimate allegiance. Lady Wisdom and Madam Folly. And you'll have a decision to make. One decision will lead you to life. The other decision will lead you to destruction. The book of Proverbs is crystal clear on this point. Now, the word itself, proverb, it's related to a verb that means to represent something, to be like something, to be comparable to something. So a proverb is a little model of some real aspect of our lives. So consider Proverbs 14:29. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. Or Proverbs 13:4. The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. Or Proverbs 11:22. Like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. They're delightful, aren't they? It's kind of like the Old Testament version of Twitter, I think, sometimes. Sometimes the wording brings a smile, right? But these are also, at the same time, deadly serious. I mean, they're not meant to be just informational or motivational or entertaining. They're designed to teach you the skills you need to live wisely. How so? Well, you need to think of a proverb like a diamond that you could pick up. And you can turn it over and over, observing all of its different angles and facets and colors. And the idea is that by doing that, you can discover something about a real-life situation before you actually step into it. Or think of it this way. When the Wright brothers flew their aircraft for the first time, they already knew it was going to take off. How? Because they'd built a wind tunnel, testing different wing designs before they actually risked their neck in an actual flight. That's what these proverbs are for. So that you can explore a real-life situation within the virtual reality of a proverb. Why? So you can know in advance what's going to fly and what's going to crash if you're considering adultery. If you make excuses not to work. If you fail to control your tongue. If you neglect to discipline your children. You see, the world says, live and learn. Proverbs teaches us, learn and live. That's what these proverbs are for. So let's not underestimate what we have here in the book of Proverbs. They're not fortune cookies. Okay, they're not meant just for bookmarks and coffee mugs. These aren't optional add-ons for people who want to maybe improve their life just a little bit. According to Proverbs itself, this wisdom, this kind of wisdom, is a matter of life and death. And part of the genius of these proverbs is found in their brevity, their shortness. So you could tell one of your children, now listen, before you commit to this particular course of action, you need to consider all of your circumstances and options. And that would be very wise advice, right? It's just not very easy to remember. You could say to your child, look before you leap. It's pithy, it's punchy, it's memorable. And at the same time, though, look before you leap doesn't tell you everything you need to know, does it? It doesn't tell you where to look, how to look, what to look for, how soon to leap after looking. In fact, it doesn't even apply to literal leaping at all, does it? The very same thing is going on with the book of Proverbs here. Okay, and that's not to criticize Proverbs, it's to draw your attention to what Proverbs really are. General nuggets of wisdom for daily life, not universal truths. They are not promises from God to be taken absolutely at all times in all situations, okay? Rather, they are general principles about what is most likely to happen if a particular course of action is followed. So, if you serve God faithfully, if you work diligently, if you treat others correctly, if you pursue purity, according to Proverbs, you will have a blessed and prosperous life. Isn't that wonderful? So what about Job? Job does everything that Proverbs says to do, but instead of experiencing blessing, he's burying his children. He's facing economic ruin. He's enduring physical suffering, all while receiving the harsh criticism of his closest friends. So has God made promises that he hasn't kept? How many faithful Christian parents with wayward children question where they went wrong by taking Proverbs 22:6 as a promise? Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. See, the most common mistake that people make with the book of Proverbs is regarding them as absolute promises, reading them literally instead of literarily, according to the genre of a proverb, on its own terms. It'd be the same thing like reading a fairy tale as if it were a history textbook. For example, Proverbs 26:4. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. And we need to know that, don't we? That trying to rationalize with a foolish person will only degenerate into more foolishness. But here's the problem. If you read that as an absolute promise for all times and all situations, then what are you going to do with the very next verse? Proverbs 26:5. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Doesn't that sound like a contradiction? It sure does, if you don't understand how to read Proverbs for what they are, according to their literary genre. But again, think about it. You already do this all the time, too. So you might say, one day, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And then the next day you might say, out of sight, out of mind. Are you contradicting yourself? No. Because you know those aren't absolute universal truths, right? Those are generalizations of truths that have been drastically condensed. This is the uniqueness of a proverb, okay? A shrewd, concentrated, general truth about a practical aspect of life. And they're designed to teach you the skill that you need to live wisely in such a way that the big, great, majestic, universal truths of theology, for all of their glory and worth, never could. And in the coming weeks here, as we turn our attention to this wisdom as it relates to our parenting and our speech and our sexuality and our money and our work, I hope that you will develop a profound appreciation for the book of Proverbs and its unique style and contribution to the Bible. But now, even more importantly, I want you to understand the prerequisite upon which all of this book depends. Okay, this is a necessary prerequisite. One thing without which nothing else matters. So if verse 1 is the title of this book, and verses 2 through 6 are the purpose of this book, which taken together are ultimately the hopes of wisdom, then verse 7 is what establishes the prerequisite of this book. Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That phrase is repeated throughout this book. In fact, all of the wisdom books in the Bible contain this phrase. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. How can they say that? It's because this wisdom has very little to do with your level of education or your intellectual ability. This wisdom depends on an appropriate disposition towards God. When it comes to wisdom, you have to begin at the beginning. And here it is. The skill for living wisely is contingent. It's dependent upon the fear of God. And listen, there's really no reason to go any further until you absorb that. If you're checking out here, and there's no point in coming the next 5 weeks, honestly. The necessary precondition for living wisely is contingent upon the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But don't misunderstand this, okay? This beginning isn't just a first step that you can eventually move on from, right? The fear of the Lord is both a doorway and a pathway. What do I mean? Well, the fear of the Lord is not like the fuel booster rockets on the side of the space shuttle that are discarded once their purpose is served, right? But neither, on the other end of the spectrum, neither is the fear of the Lord the sum total of knowledge, like all you have to do is fear the Lord and then you'll be wise. No, this isn't a call for empty-headed reverence either. What this is saying is that the fear of the Lord is like what the ABCs are to Shakespeare. The fear of the Lord, in comparison to knowledge, is what do re mi is like compared to performing Mozart. It's what 2 + 2 = 4 is to calculus. Okay, so that the ABCs are not Shakespeare, but you can't do away with the ABCs when you go to read Hamlet. The fear of the Lord is the necessary prerequisite for wisdom. Without it, without the fear of the Lord, wisdom is not attainable. So it's not about brains, okay? It's about disposition. It's about your posture before God. But what is this fear of the Lord? I mean, we need to understand this, right? If this is the doorway and the pathway to wisdom, the fear of the Lord, we need to know what this means. What is the fear of the Lord? Here's a simple definition. The appropriate response of faith to God's self-revelation. The fear of the Lord is the appropriate response of faith to God's self-revelation. And I see some of you writing that down. It's good to know this. But because we tend to try to take the sting out of what the fear of the Lord means, I want you to think about this more in terms of situations rather than definitions. So think with me for a second here. What is the fear of the Lord? Think about Moses, who, when he encounters the burning bush, is terrified to look at God in his self-revelation. Think of Isaiah, who cries out, "Woe is me," when he encounters that vision of God in his throne room. Think of Daniel, who, when given a revelation of God, he's drained of all strength and he falls to the ground. Think of Job, who cowers repentantly in response to God's revelation of his sovereignty over all creation. And maybe even more helpfully, think about the responses of people who encounter God's ultimate self-revelation, his Son, Jesus Christ. Think of the Magi, who upon seeing God's self-revelation in that child fall down and worship him. Think of the crowds who were seized by fear when Jesus raises a dead widow's son to life. Or what about Peter? After a long, unsuccessful night fishing on the water, Jesus miraculously fills the nets with an astonishing catch. So what's Peter's response of faith to this self-revelation of God? Does he leap for joy, throw a party, give Jesus a high five? He fell down at Jesus' knees and said, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Or what about the time the terrified disciples woke him up during a violent storm while they were out on the Sea of Galilee? On that occasion, God's self-revelation was astonishingly simple, right? Peace, be still. Which was exactly what happened. But the calm that occurred outside the boat was now the cause of an even greater terror inside the boat. Remember? They were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the winds and the seas obey him?" Who then is this? It's a question that gets answered shortly thereafter when on a mountaintop, Jesus is revealed in all of his radiant glory and splendor, and God says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." How do Peter, James, and John respond? They fell on their faces and were terrified. What is the fear of the Lord? It is the appropriate response of faith to God's self-revelation. It describes a right disposition before God. It is all at once an attitude of repentance, surrender, worship, and obedience. It's the simultaneous response of shrinking back in fear and drawing close in awe. And when that happens, when a person encounters Jesus Christ in his glory and splendor and responds like that, then nobody has to follow you around with a tedious checklist of do's and don'ts. Because your motivation for obedience now comes from a deep fear of the Lord. And suddenly, now, every moment is the Lord's time. Every cent is the Lord's money. Every relationship is the Lord's opportunity. Every duty is the Lord's command. Every blessing is the Lord's gift. Now you're ready to obtain wisdom, and not a moment before. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The skill for living wisely is contingent upon the fear of the Lord. Over and against who? Into verse 7, fools. Fools who despise wisdom and instruction. It's a strong word. Despise. The fool has contempt for wisdom. The fool arrogantly thinks he is beyond wisdom. Something the book of Proverbs makes very clear by the fact that the fool never listens in this book. The fool always has an explanation, always has a justification, always has an excuse. Look at his end in verse 28 of chapter 1. This is Lady Wisdom speaking. Proverbs 1:28, speaking of the fool. Then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me. Because they hated knowledge, listen, and did not choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel, and despised all my reproof, therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way, and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. Nothing funny about being a fool in the book of Proverbs. The fool in Proverbs is not a person who lacks intelligence, it's a person who's morally perverse. The fool in Proverbs isn't stupid. The fool in Proverbs is wicked. He has no fear of the Lord. No fear of God, who has most fully revealed himself to us in the person of Jesus Christ. So, in other words, you could say the fool has failed to recognize Jesus Christ for who he is. Think back to Solomon for a minute. Until Jesus Christ came on the scene, Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. And after a while, with Solomon, things looked really good. So much potential there. God had promised Solomon's father, King David, that one day his descendant would rule over an eternal kingdom. And for the first 10 chapters or so in 1 Kings, Solomon's fear of the Lord is displayed in wonderful expressions of wisdom. I mean, it looks like he might be the fulfillment of God's promises. But when we get to chapter 11 of 1 Kings, something happens. A kind of anti-wisdom takes over. Solomon ceases to fear the Lord, and the whole situation deteriorates, ending ultimately in the division of the kingdom. But God's promise was not undone. The Old Testament continued to promise a Messiah, one who would be anointed with the spirit of wisdom and understanding, Isaiah 11. The servant of Yahweh who would act wisely, Isaiah 52:13. So we're not surprised then when we come to the New Testament and we read as a young boy that Jesus, the Messiah, increased in wisdom. Luke chapter 2. That when he taught in his hometown synagogue, his astonished neighbors asked, where did this man get his wisdom? Matthew 13. Jesus was the wisest man who ever lived. Why? Precisely because he feared the Lord like no one ever had. Totally surrendering himself. surrendering himself to the perfect will of his Father, enduring spiritual abandonment, enduring a humiliating death, so that by his sufferings he might become for us the very wisdom of God. 1 Corinthians 1:24 and verse 30. Jesus said to the Pharisees, the queen of the south, the queen of Sheba, will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. Don't patronize Jesus Christ as a nice man who provides warm religious fuzzies while you read self-help books and listen to Dr. Phil for the real challenges of life. Jesus is wisdom incarnate. He's never been outthought or surprised or perplexed. He's never been tricked or fooled or deceived. He has eyes like a flame of fire that can see everything. There is no thought or action that is unintelligible to him. He knows all things, past, present, and future. And so this morning, if you seek the wisdom of Proverbs, it is the Apostle Paul who tells you, in whom all of it is perfectly embodied. In Jesus Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. He's the only one who ever feared God perfectly. He's the only one who's ever known God perfectly. He said, no one knows who the Father is except the Son and anyone whom the Son chooses to reveal to him. Do you understand what that means? You need Jesus' knowledge. You need Jesus' wisdom in order to know God. Jesus Christ taught wisdom. Jesus Christ lived wisdom. Jesus Christ is wisdom incarnate. Do you need wisdom? Then you need to begin at the beginning. You need Jesus Christ. The skill for living wisely is contingent upon the fear of the Lord. What is the fear of the Lord? The fear of the Lord is simply an appropriate response of faith to God's self-revelation in the person of Jesus Christ. C.S. Lewis wrote this: in God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. Do you desire wisdom? Here's where you begin. You look at the cross, and you see a wise man hanging there, dying in the place of fools like you. You may despise him, but he does not despise you. You may think yourself above him, but he humbled himself for you. Look away from yourself and look at him. Keep looking until your foolish pride melts away. And then you will not only worship, you will begin to grow wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Will you join us on the pathway to wisdom? First, you have to enter by the doorway of wisdom. You have to begin at the beginning. Something greater than Solomon is here. Jesus is greater in holiness, he's greater in glory, he's greater in power, and far greater in wisdom. So let us worship his wisdom, let us hear his wise teaching, let us be made wise unto salvation, and let us live wisely to his glory and honor.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.